The road stretched endlessly under a hazy morning sky, soft light rippling across the worn asphalt like memories drifting through time. Solomon Dryden's hands gripped the wheel firmly, his knuckles pale against the dark leather. The Marine Corps ring on his finger glinted briefly as the sun peeked through the clouds. 8 hours behind him, countless more thoughts ahead. He hadn't been back to Elmridge in over a decade. The last time, his wife, Denise, was still alive, vibrant, fierce, always insisting their son would grow up to be something greater. Now, it was just Solomon and the photo taped to the dashboard, Denise smiling beside a beaming 6-year-old Tyron, both wrapped in graduation-colored streamers from a school fundraiser so many years ago. He hadn't taken the interstate. He needed the back roads, needed the time to think, to remember, to breathe. There was something sacred about this journey, something he hadn't admitted out loud even to himself. This wasn't just about attending a high school graduation. It was about fulfilling a promise whispered into the wind on a long-ago evening, kneeling beside Denise's hospital bed when the machines had finally gone silent. "I'll be there for him," he had said through clenched teeth and wet cheeks. "Every milestone. No matter what it takes." Now here he was. A retired Marine, decorated but weary, driving across state lines in his neatly pressed uniform, collar straight, boots shined, medals in place. The uniform gave him a sense of order, of dignity. But it also made people stare. At a rest stop just over the state border, he'd taken a moment to breathe. A little girl had pointed at him and whispered to her mother, "Look, a soldier." The mother had smiled politely, then quickly pulled the child away. Solomon hadn't said a word. He didn't need to. Not today. He opened the glove box and took out the photo once more, running his fingers gently across the glossy surface. Tyron had his mother's eyes, deep, expressive, impossible to hide behind. That same expression had glimmered on the video call the night before, when Tyron had said, "Dad, you sure you're coming?" "It's just high school." "Son," Solomon had replied, "I missed too many things already. I'm not missing this." The school came into view around 9:40 a.m., nestled between rows of old maple trees and a brick-lined main street that hadn't changed since the 70s. Elmridge High, red banners, proud eagle mascot, seniors taking selfies on the front steps. Solomon parked a block away and took a moment before stepping out. He adjusted the creases in his uniform, straightened his back, and checked the address on the invite. Row D, Seat 17, reserved by Tyron weeks ago. He carried no bag, no weapon, no fanfare. Just the photo. Tucked carefully into the inner pocket of his jacket, over his heart. As he walked toward the school, people began to notice. Some nodded. Some stared. One man near the entrance narrowed his eyes and leaned to whisper to another. Solomon had seen that look before, overseas, in certain towns, in certain boardrooms. It was the look that asked without asking, "What is he doing here?" He kept walking. Not out of pride. Not out of defiance. But because his son was inside that building. And nothing on God's green earth was going to stop him from being there. The bell rang inside the gym. A wave of students, parents, and faculty shuffled into the building. Solomon waited his turn at the entrance, handing his ticket to a volunteer, a teen girl who looked up at him, startled for a second, then smiled softly. "You're in the front section, sir. Follow the signs for Section D." He nodded and made his way in, the photo close to his chest. He hadn't come for attention. He hadn't come to stir up anything. But attention had already found him. As he stepped into the main hall, the buzz of conversation slowed, heads turned, and all eyes began to fall on the uniformed figure walking toward the reserved seats, not all of them friendly. The gymnasium at Elmridge High had been transformed, rows of folding chairs lined the glossy floor, red and gold streamers swayed gently from the rafters, and the school band rehearsed one last note of pomp and circumstance before falling into stillness. The hum of conversation was everywhere, proud parents flipping through programs, restless younger siblings fidgeting, and graduates adjusting caps that refused to sit just right. Solomon Dryden stood at the entrance for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the lights and noise. He scanned the crowd and spotted Section D, middle row, near the aisle, just like Tyron had promised. He made his way forward slowly, his black marine dress blues cutting a distinct figure among the summer polos and floral blouses. Every step seemed to draw another glance. Not openly hostile, not exactly, but uncertain. Curious. Appraising. When Solomon reached row D, seat 17, he paused. A laminated name tag was taped to the back, reserved, S. Dryden. He exhaled once, quietly, and sat down. The seat creaked slightly under his weight, but otherwise, all was still. He removed his cap and held it neatly in his lap. A woman 2 seats down, blonde, mid-40s, crisp sundress, glanced over, then quickly looked away. Her teenage son leaned toward her and whispered something. She shook her head. Solomon didn't react. He just sat, straight-backed, eyes forward, breathing steady. Around him, the noise of the crowd flowed like waves around a rock, people shifting, chatting, rising for photos. But he remained still. When the band struck up the graduation march, the audience rose in a synchronized wave. Solomon remained seated. Not out of defiance. Not even out of discomfort. He simply placed a hand over his heart and closed his eyes, the way he had been taught. A gesture of reverence. Of memory. Of the friends he'd buried and the sacrifices made. But not everyone saw it that way. From behind him, a voice whispered, "Why isn't he standing?" Another murmured, "Is he supposed to be here?" And then, a pair of footsteps. Firm. Purposeful. Close. Solomon opened his eyes and turned slightly. 2 men in navy blazers and security tags approached from the side aisle. One was tall and heavy-set, the other shorter with thinning gray hair. Both wore earpieces and matching expressions of polite discomfort, the kind of look people put on when preparing to deliver unpleasant news they believe will be received poorly. "Sir," the tall one began, leaning in. "May we have a word with you?" Solomon looked at him evenly. "Is there an issue?" "This section is reserved for family members only. We were informed there may have been a mix-up." Solomon reached into his jacket pocket and silently handed them the printed ticket, name, seat number, row, all clearly visible. The shorter guard squinted at it. "We understand, but we've had some concerns raised by other guests." "Concerns?" Solomon asked, voice low but clear. "About what?" Neither man answered directly. The taller one stepped back slightly, eyes darting across the crowd. "Would you mind stepping out with us for just a moment?" he tried again, quieter this time. "Just to clarify things." Solomon stayed seated. "No, I would mind." People nearby were beginning to notice. Heads turned. Conversations tapered off into silence. The woman in the sundress 2 seats down was now openly watching. "I'm Tyron Dryden's father," Solomon said, his voice level. "This seat was reserved for me. By him." The tall guard straightened, mouth opening to respond, but nothing came out. The shorter one shifted uneasily. A small child in the row behind whispered, "Mommy, what's happening?" Solomon remained still. Calm. Dignified. But his presence, quiet as it was, had become the center of the room. From the stage, a teacher glanced down, noticing the commotion. Tyron, seated among his classmates in the front row, turned his head. He couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see the tension in his father's posture. He could see the way the guards hovered. And Solomon could see him, too. Their eyes met across the gym, father and son, both still, both silent. The tall guard tried again. "We're not trying to cause a scene, sir. We're just—" "I'm not leaving," Solomon said, not loud, but firm enough to carry. And the room seemed to hold its breath. The guards shifted nervously as footsteps echoed from the back of the gym, 6 men entering in unison, exuding quiet authority, each one headed directly toward Solomon. The crowd wasn't whispering anymore. The room had gone eerily still, save for the solemn chords of the school band quietly trailing off. Eyes had stopped tracking the graduates on stage and instead turned towards Section D, toward the tall, still figure of Solomon Dryden and the two security guards who now looked far less certain than they had a minute ago. Then came the sound of boots, not loud, not rushed, but distinct, measured, and together. From the back of the gymnasium, the side doors opened in near silence. 6 men walked in. They weren't wearing uniforms, but they didn't need to. Everything about them, their stance, their gaze, the way they moved in unison, announced their presence more clearly than any insignia could. Dark suits. Clean-cut. Shoulders squared. Faces like stone. Solomon didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. He felt it. That quiet energy he'd only ever known in the field, when a brother stepped into the room and nothing needed to be said. The lead man moved with a calm kind of gravity. His name was Creed Marston, former Navy SEAL, retired at 39, now a contractor and father of 2. Solomon had once carried Creed on his back through a smoke-choked ravine in Kandahar when an IED shattered the squad's line. They hadn't spoken in nearly 5 years. But today, Creed was here. As he reached Solomon's row, Creed stopped, placing a hand gently on the shoulder of the tall guard. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, voice like distant thunder, low, calm, unmistakably firm. The guard stiffened. "Sir, we were just trying to resolve a seating issue." Creed held up one finger. "This man's name is Solomon Dryden. You know who that is?" The guard blinked. Not exactly." "Well, I do," Creed said, still calm. "He's a retired master sergeant. Bronze Star, Purple Heart. The reason 6 of us walked out of a desert alive." The gym grew colder somehow, despite the packed crowd and June heat. One by one, the other 5 men lined up behind Creed, forming a quiet wall behind Solomon, their eyes never leaving the guards. "This seat," Creed continued, gesturing to the laminated tag on Solomon's chair, "was reserved by his son, Tyron Dryden. Who's about to graduate from this school. You're telling me there's a problem with that?" The shorter guard opened his mouth to reply but didn't find the words. In the front row of graduates, Tyron was frozen, hands clenched on his knees. Every student around him was now turned halfway in their chairs, watching. Some with confusion. Others with awe. Solomon remained seated. His expression hadn't changed, but something deeper stirred behind his eyes, a flicker of pain, of weariness, of restraint so deep it had become second nature. "I came here to watch my son walk across that stage," he said quietly. "Not to cause a scene. Not to be questioned. Just to keep a promise." A few rose up, a parent murmured, "He's the boy's father. This is wrong." The murmur grew into a ripple, a dozen voices whispering, questioning. A teacher on the stage looked over at the principal, who stood frozen near the podium. "Gentlemen," Creed said, addressing the guards now in a tone that was suddenly less forgiving, "I suggest you step aside." The taller guard looked at his partner, then down at the program in his hand. His jaw tightened. He gave a tight nod and stepped back. The shorter one followed. Creed turned to Solomon and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone," he said simply. For the first time since entering the gym, Solomon's expression softened, just a trace. He gave a subtle nod. But the attention hadn't faded. Dozens of students were watching. Dozens of parents. The gym was no longer just a setting for a graduation, it had become a lesson in dignity, in strength, in silent solidarity. From across the stage, the principal stepped forward, adjusting his microphone, and the room braced itself for whether he would restore order, or add to the silence. For a moment, the principal just stood there, hand on the microphone, eyes scanning the room like he wasn't sure where to begin, or whether to say anything at all. The silence was thick. Not hostile, not angry, but watchful. Every person in that gym knew the moment had cracked open into something bigger than just seating arrangements. Principal Hanley cleared his throat and leaned into the mic. His voice echoed across the bleachers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your continued patience as we prepare to begin today's ceremony. He looked directly at the guards still lingering near Solomon and added, more pointedly, all reserved seating will be honored as assigned. There was no applause, no cheers, just a shifting of posture, like the crowd had collectively exhaled but wasn't ready to relax yet. The two guards stepped further back, their authority diminished by a single sentence and the silent presence of the men behind Solomon. Creed Marston said nothing more. He simply moved to stand behind the last row in Section D, his arms folded in front of him, expression unreadable. The 5 other SEALs followed, forming a quiet phalanx, not blocking anyone, not posturing, just being there. And that was enough. Solomon remained seated, both hands resting lightly on his knees, his eyes focused ahead. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. But inside, something settled. The kind of settling that comes when you realize you're not standing alone anymore, even if you've grown used to it. The school band restarted the opening bars of Pomp and Circumstance. This time, the notes sounded clearer, steadier. The graduates began filing in, row by row, their faces bright with youth and nerves and hope. In the front row, Tyron Dryden stood among his classmates, hands still tight at his sides. He hadn't taken his eyes off his father since the moment those guards approached. He watched every second, the confrontation, the backup, the silent defense by men who barely needed to speak to make their point. He saw it all. Tyron had grown up knowing his father was respected. He had heard stories, how Solomon served in Fallujah, how he saved lives, how he never once boasted about any of it. But this was the first time he truly witnessed the weight of his father's name. He blinked hard, fighting the sting rising behind his eyes. When his row was called to move, he walked tall, not just as a graduate, but as the son of a man whose quiet strength had filled the room without needing to raise his voice. Back in Section D, a few more people were now glancing towards Solomon, not with confusion, but with a kind of reverent curiosity. One woman leaned over and whispered to another, "Who is he?" Her friend replied, "I don't know. But those 6 men sure did." On stage, Principal Hanley continued with the formalities, welcoming parents, honoring faculty, introducing the guest speaker. But even as the ceremony resumed its usual rhythm, a new energy lingered. One that hadn't been there before. Respect. Reflection. Stillness. No one dared approach Solomon again. Not the guards. Not the skeptical onlookers. Not even the principal. Because now, whatever unspoken question had filled the room at the beginning, "What is he doing here?" had been answered with something stronger than words. He belonged here. And no one had the right to say otherwise. Down below, Tyron was handed the microphone for his senior class remarks, but instead of reading the speech he'd written, he looked out at the crowd, then straight at his father, and made a decision that would leave the room in stunned silence. Tyron Dryden stood at the podium, speech in hand, but his fingers didn't move to unfold the paper. His heart thudded in his chest, louder than the echo of the gym's speakers. All eyes were on him, the senior class president, top of his year, the kid with the full-ride scholarship and the quiet charisma everyone liked. He had practiced this speech a dozen times. In his room. In front of the mirror. In front of his mom's old picture frame. It was safe, polished, full of gratitude and school spirit. But none of that mattered now. Not after what just happened. Tyron looked up. Across the crowd, his eyes locked on Solomon, seated, steady, surrounded by a silent wall of SEALs. And suddenly, something shifted in him. A fire. A clarity. He folded the speech in half and placed it gently on the podium. A ripple of curiosity stirred through the audience. Then Tyron spoke. "My name is Tyron Dryden," he began, voice clear and calm. "I'm standing here today because I worked hard, stayed late, and tried to do right by my teachers, my friends, and this school. But I also stand here because someone else worked even harder, in ways most of you will never see." The room went still again. "My father is sitting in Section D," he said, turning slightly and pointing. "The man in the Marine uniform. The one some people tried to remove just a few minutes ago." There was no anger in his tone. Just truth. I didn't tell many people about him growing up, Tyron continued. He was gone a lot. First deployments, then surgeries. He missed birthdays. Holidays. Even my 8th grade promotion. Not because he didn't care, but because he was serving this country. Because he was out there defending people who didn't even know his name. A low murmur swept through the bleachers. The faculty on stage exchanged glances. Tyron stood taller. Some of you saw him today and saw his uniform before you saw the man. And that's okay. Sometimes the world teaches us to judge first and ask later. But I've learned something different, from my dad, and from the men who just walked into this gym to stand behind him. He gestured toward the back, where the 6 SEALs stood like stone pillars. They didn't speak. They didn't argue. They didn't push. They just showed up, like warriors do. Like family does. His voice grew stronger. Honor doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't need a stage or a microphone. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is stand still. A long pause. No one moved. Tyron took a breath. This diploma I'm about to receive, it's not just for me. It's for him. And for everyone who ever sat where they were told they didn't belong. It's for every father who chose to show up, even when the world made it hard. He stepped back from the mic. Silence. Then, somewhere in the back, a single pair of hands began to clap. Slow. Deliberate. Another joined. Then another. And then the room erupted, not in the forced cheer of a graduation ritual, but in something real. A standing ovation, row after row rising to their feet, not just for Tyron, but for the quiet figure in row D, seat 17. Solomon didn't move. He remained seated, hand over his heart, the same way he had when the music first played. Creed Marston glanced down at him and murmured, "I think she'd be proud." Solomon nodded once. No words. His eyes shimmered, but he didn't blink. Because he couldn't afford to miss a single second. As the applause finally softened, the principal returned to the mic, visibly shaken, and announced an unscheduled addition to the program, a spontaneous award, in Solomon Dryden's name. The microphone crackled softly as Principal Hanley stepped forward, visibly unsettled yet composed. His glasses slid down the bridge of his nose, and for a long moment, he didn't speak. He simply looked out over the gym full of people, no longer just parents and students, but witnesses to something bigger than graduation. "I've served as principal of Elmridge High for 18 years, he began, voice thick with emotion. But today is the first time I've found myself without words." He looked down at his note cards, then folded them in half and set them aside, following Tyron's lead, whether consciously or not. What we saw just now, what we felt, is something this school will carry for years to come. A hush fell over the room again. "There's no section in the program for what I'm about to do," Hanley continued. "But sometimes, life writes in the margins." He turned to a staff member standing off stage and whispered something. The staffer nodded and disappeared behind the curtain. Then Hanley looked toward Section D. "Master Sergeant Solomon Dryden," he said, "will you please stand?" There was a pause. Solomon, caught off guard for the first time all day, slowly rose to his feet. His posture was as straight as ever, but his expression held something new, surprise, confusion, and a trace of vulnerability he didn't often show. Principal Hanley spoke into the mic once more. "On behalf of the faculty, staff, students, and families of Elmridge High School, we would like to present you with the school's first ever Honorary Guardian Award, in recognition of your lifelong service, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication not only to your country, but to your son." A staff member returned with a framed plaque, hastily printed, no doubt, but beautiful in its sincerity. A gold plate gleamed at the bottom. "Solomon Dryden, for exemplary courage, silent leadership, and the unshakable love of a father." The gym rose to its feet again. This time, even louder. Even fuller. Students. Parents. Teachers. Janitors. Coaches. Everyone. Solomon didn't take a bow. He didn't raise his hand. He simply nodded, once, a small, deeply human gesture, and returned to his seat, eyes moist, jaw locked. Beside him, Creed leaned in. "You good?" Solomon gave a soft grunt. "You shut up." Creed grinned. The ceremony resumed, but now it pulsed with meaning. One by one, students were called to the stage, shaking hands, snapping photos, but it was different now. Tyron's words had altered something in the air. When Tyron's name was called, Tyron Emmanuel Dryden, the applause was thunderous. He walked across the stage with his shoulders high, a quiet fire in his step. Principal Hanley shook his hand and pulled him in for a brief, whispered word, "Thank you for what you gave us today." Tyron nodded, took his diploma, and turned toward the crowd. And then, in front of hundreds of eyes, he did something no one expected. He raised his hand in a formal military salute, not to the stage, not to the faculty, but toward Row D. Solomon didn't return the salute. Instead, he stood slowly and placed his hand back over his heart, just as he had at the beginning of the ceremony. Father and son. Silent. Still. Unshakable. In the back of the room, Creed and the SEALs all stood and did the same, a gesture of respect deeper than applause. The gymnasium had been built for basketball games and assemblies. But on that day, it held something sacred. After the ceremony, as families spilled out into the parking lot and photos were snapped beneath bright banners, a local news reporter stepped through the crowd, eyes locked on Solomon, and said, "Sir, would you be willing to share your story?" Here is Chapter 7 written in warm, cinematic American English, following the approved D1 structure. Outside the gymnasium, the school parking lot buzzed with life. Laughter mingled with camera shutters, parents called for their graduates to pose just one more time, and caps sailed into the sky like startled birds. But just beyond the edge of that cheerful chaos, Solomon stood quietly beneath a tall maple tree, the sunlight filtering down across the polished surface of his Marine Corps insignia. His jacket was neatly buttoned, but his posture had softened, not in pride or exhaustion, but in something deeper. Peace. Tyron stood next to him, diploma still clutched in one hand, tie slightly loosened, eyes full of something that hadn't been there this morning, clarity. They weren't speaking, not with words. Just standing. Breathing in the moment. Letting it settle. Then came the voice. "Master Sergeant Dryden?" They turned. A woman in her mid-30s, holding a microphone and flanked by a cameraman, approached with caution in her step. A press badge hung from her lanyard, WETR Channel 5, local news. Solomon sighed, not from annoyance, but from weariness. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the woman said gently. "But, would you be willing to say a few words? A lot of people inside were asking your name. Your story. We don't want to twist it, we just think people deserve to know what happened here today." Solomon looked at Tyron. Tyron gave a small nod. After a moment, Solomon turned to the camera and said, "You rolling?" The cameraman nodded silently. Solomon looked straight into the lens, eyes steady. "There's not much to tell that hasn't already been seen. I came here to watch my son graduate. That's it. I didn't expect to be noticed. I sure didn't expect to be challenged. But I stayed." He paused, then added, "And people stood with me." The reporter asked softly, "Why do you think they did?" He turned his head, looked toward the gym. "Because some people remember what respect looks like. Even when it's quiet." The reporter lowered the mic. "Thank you, sir. That's all we needed." As they walked away, Creed approached from behind, hands in his pockets, still as collected as ever. "You going viral," he said with a grin. "Bet your face is all over local Facebook by now." Solomon shook his head, smirking. "Only thing I want going viral is Tyron's tuition check clearing." Laughter. Then, unexpectedly, Principal Hanley walked up, without a microphone, without a crowd. He stopped in front of Solomon and extended his hand. "I owe you an apology," he said, voice rough around the edges. "Not just for what happened today, but for what we didn't do sooner." This school teaches history, character, ethics, but we clearly forgot how to recognize it when it was sitting in our front row. Solomon looked at the man's hand for a beat, then shook it firmly. You recognized it. Eventually. That counts. Hanley nodded. Still. It won't happen again. Beside them, the two guards, no longer in uniform, clearly sent home, lingered in the background. One looked away. The other approached, eyes downcast. I was wrong, sir, the taller one said. It wasn't about the seat. That was just an excuse. I judged what I didn't know. Solomon studied the man for a long second. Not with anger, but with that cool, surgical stillness honed over years of choosing when to speak and when not to. Then he said, You're not the first. You won't be the last. Just don't do it again. The man nodded, visibly humbled, and turned to leave. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Tyron pulled his father aside. Dad, he said, voice hushed. Today was bigger than I expected. Solomon smiled faintly. Yeah. That happens when truth gets louder than comfort. Tyron held out the diploma. This is yours too. Solomon shook his head. No. That one's all you. But the way you used your voice today? He paused. That'll echo longer than paper ever could. Father and son walked toward the car slowly. Behind them, the campus began to empty. But something stayed behind, not a banner, not a photo, but the feeling. The shift. As they opened the car door, Tyron hesitated, looked back one last time, and asked, Dad, do you think Mom saw all of it? Solomon didn't answer right away, just gazed up into the glowing sky, then whispered, She never missed a thing. The road home looked different this time. Maybe it was the soft golden hue of late afternoon washing across the trees. Maybe it was the weight that had quietly lifted from Solomon's shoulders. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the silence between father and son that finally felt full instead of heavy. Tyron sat in the passenger seat, the diploma resting across his lap like a folded flag. He hadn't said much since they left Elmridge High, but he hadn't needed to. Not anymore. Solomon drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on the picture tucked into the center console, the same one he'd carried across state lines, the same one he used to talk to when the house was too quiet. Denise's smile still shone as bright as it had when Tyron was 6. Mind a detour? Solomon asked. Tyron looked over. Where? Solomon nodded up ahead. Just trust me. They pulled off the main road and wound down a familiar gravel path, trees arching overhead like a cathedral. The small cemetery came into view, modest, peaceful, with wind chimes hanging from an old oak at its edge. Solomon parked, stepped out, and opened the trunk. He pulled out a single sunflower and a folded American flag he'd kept in pristine condition since the day Denise was laid to rest. Tyron followed silently. They knelt side by side at her grave. No fanfare. No speeches. Just presence. Solomon laid the sunflower gently against the headstone, then unfolded the flag and draped it across his knees. Hey, Denny, he said, his voice softer than Tyron had ever heard it. He did it. You'd be proud. He stood taller than I ever taught him to. Tyron swallowed hard. We had a moment today, Mom. One of those ones I'll tell my kids about someday. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver pin, the class valedictorian badge he'd been too overwhelmed to wear earlier. Quietly, he placed it at the base of the stone. Solomon let out a breath, slow and deep. Then he turned to Tyron. You know, he said, when I first joined the Corps, I thought legacy meant medals. Citations. Records. He looked back at the headstone, then toward his son. I was wrong. Legacy is what stays behind when we're gone. It's what people remember when they don't have to. Tyron nodded. I think I want to do more than what I planned, Dad. Not just college. Something that matters. Maybe public service. Maybe advocacy. Solomon smiled, not wide, but real. "You want to change the world," he said. "Start by standing up when it's easier to sit down." They rose together and returned to the car. As they drove off, the wind picked up just enough to lift the chimes on the oak tree. A soft melody danced behind them. Weeks later, the video clip from Elmridge High had gone viral. News outlets called it the stand-in Section D. Commentators dissected it. Veterans shared it. Parents wept watching Tyron's speech. But Solomon never watched the full broadcast. He didn't need to. Instead, he read letters. Dozens of them. From strangers. From students. From fathers who said they'd shown up for their kids for the first time in years, because of what they saw that day. And one morning, Tyron stepped into the kitchen holding a thin envelope with a government seal. Solomon raised an eyebrow. "Looks official," he said. Tyron opened it slowly, then grinned. "I got accepted into the U.S. Service Fellows Program. Full ride. DC placement." Solomon took a beat. "Then, she never missed a thing," he said again. Tyron smiled. "Neither did you." They didn't hug. Not then. Just stood in that kitchen, coffee brewing, light pouring through the window like a benediction. Two men, shaped by silence, bonded by action. Not by what they'd said, but by what they stood for. In the years to come, the story of Section D would be shared at veterans' halls, classrooms, leadership retreats, and dinner tables. But to Tyron and Solomon, it was never about going viral. It was about one seat, one stand, and the quiet courage to show up. Always.